Hello, I'm CJ Werleman, and in this episode, we answer all of your questions as it relates to the downfall of the Assad regime, and what this means for the Syrian people, Israel, and a future Palestinian state. But first, please remember to like and subscribe to our show. Now let's get into it. 24 million Syrians are waking up to a new dawn, most of whom have only known their country under the repressive and brutal rule of Bashar al-Assad and his father Hafez, who together terrorized the population as the regime plundered the country's wealth and resources for the past 54 years. Assad was the embodiment of oppression, the embodiment of cruelty, which made him the perfect ally of the United States and Israel during their so-called war on terror. But today, a new reality begins, with the dictator fleeing to Russia and the Syrian people rejoicing as one nation and one people as Christians come together with their Muslim brothers and sisters to celebrate his downfall and the beginning of a new Syria. This is the city of Hama on Sunday, where celebrations have only just begun. A city where Hafez Assad ordered 15,000 regime soldiers to mass murder 40,000 Syrians who peacefully protested against his rule. To this day, the Hama massacre remains the single deadliest act of violence perpetrated by an Arab state upon its own population in the history of the modern Middle East. It's a reminder that the Syrian revolution didn't begin last week, but decades ago, the same way the Palestinian resistance to Israel's criminal occupation didn't begin on October 7th. We are talking about a tyrant who murdered 800,000 of his own people during the past decade and a half, while forcibly displacing another 13 million citizens. But today, with great irony, Assad now counts himself a Syrian refugee, and good riddance. The roads and highways leading to Syria from Jordan, Iraq, Lebanon and Turkey are now jammed full of cars and buses, carrying displaced Syrians who have languished in squalid refugee camps for years. Border crossings are lining up with Syrians who finally feel it's safe to return home.
These are extraordinary scenes. Bab al-Hawa crossing going into Syria usually had traffic and trickle of people coming into Turkey. Now, you can see people here who are going back into Syria. They say that they have now a hope. They have now something that they've been longing for since 2011, when many of them were forced out of their homes. They had to leave their homes. They did not want to leave their homes. But now there is an opportunity for them to go back into a Syria which is after Bashar al-Assad.
What felt like a pipe dream for 13 million displaced Syrians only a few weeks ago is now a glorious new reality, as families reunite after years of separation and war. You're watching a mother who was freed from an Assad prison in Homs reunite with her children she hadn't seen in years. This euphoria is being experienced all across the country today. A joy that's tempered, however, with the painful process of learning the fate of others loved and missing.
اليوم أنا مثل كل هالسوريين، مشاعرنا ملخبطة بين الخوف والرجاء، الألم، الأمل، الفرح لرجعة كل معتقل لأهله. بس مثل كتير لسه ناطرين على أمل يرجعوا إخواتي اللي اعتقلوا بال2011، محمد وعبد الستار ومجد، إخواتي اللي النظام خبرنا مرة إنه هو استشهدوا، لكن لسه عنا أمل إنه يكونوا بخير.
Syrian social media is now flooded with people posting images of their disappeared family members, a plea for any information that might determine their whereabouts or fate. Sadly, many have received the worst of news, as the world now learns the full extent of the horrors that took place inside the Assad regime's notorious Sednaya prison, which was described by human rights activists as a human slaughterhouse.
Within the walls are untold stories of horror. When the opposition took ground from the regime, they opened the doors of detention centers across the country. But in Sednaya, only a few hundred walked out. The search for answers in this darkness continues.
For many Syrians, this prison is a symbol of the Assad dynasty's brutal rule. The images that are coming out of this detention facility are the reasons why people took to the streets in 2011 to demand justice, the rule of law, and democracy.
It was here that Assad tortured 50,000 Syrians to death during the first 2 years of the revolution alone, from 2011 to 2013, as documented in leaked regime reports. We will soon learn exactly how many were murdered in the 11 years since, because the silence has been broken. The doors to this concentration camp are now finally flung open as emaciated and traumatized doctors, artists, activists, journalists, and even young children emerge from the darkness and into the light of a now liberated Syria. One of those freed is a former Syrian Air Force pilot who was arrested in 1981 after refusing orders to bomb his fellow citizens during the Hama massacre. These women and children were freed from their prison cells by the revolution on Sunday, but it will take them a lifetime to heal from the abuses they have suffered at the hands of Assad's henchmen, particularly those who were victims of systemic rape. The footage of this toddler wandering terrified and alone in the bottom level of a tortured dungeon is an image Syrians will never forget. But thankfully, this child is now freed, along with more than 100,000 other political prisoners, including thousands of Palestinians who had been detained and tortured by Assad for years. And not just ordinary Palestinians, but also members of Hamas and other Palestinian resistance groups, including the commander of the Al-Qassam brigades in Syria, Abu Jafar al-Jaladi, as reported by a Palestinian human rights group on Monday. Therefore proving once again that Assad was never a friend of Palestine, a fact every Palestinian well knows, given Assad mass-murdered 4,000 of them in Yarmouk and Tadamon. It's not surprising then that Hamas affirmed its full support for the revolution in an official statement on Monday, with Palestinians in Gaza taking to the streets and handing out sweets to celebrate the downfall of Assad. A recent poll conducted by a Palestinian NGO found that 83% of Palestinians support the revolution against the Syrian dictator. This man from Gaza explains why.
هم بشعين على مناطق في بلادهم وفضحتهم اقسم بالله العظيم بكتني وحياة الله لاني قست هذا الاشي على حالي لان انا واحد من الناس اللي مشتاق ارجع لمنطقتي ولبيتي ولحارتي اللي طلعوني منها وعندي امل ان شاء الله في يوم من الايام راح ارجع وان شاء الله الفرحه بتوسع على كل واحد سوري وعلى كل واحد فلسطيني وعلينا كلنا في غزه الله يرفع عنا وعنكم جميعا وتحياتي من غزه لكل اهل سوريا واتمنى من الجميع خطيه برقابكم تدعونا في غزه الله يسعد قلوبكم ويفرحكم يا رب عقبال هالفرحه ما تدخلنا عنا في غزه يا رب.
To borrow the words of a famous Palestinian commentator, that the very first thing the revolution did after liberating Syria was to go prison to prison and let everyone out. This is how you know these revolutionaries are Syrians and that this is a liberation. No Zionist orchestrated plot would ever free Hamas fighters and activists, along with Syrian and Palestinian political prisoners.
2015 دخلوك عايز الزنادة اللي تحت صح قديش ضلت فيها؟ بالفرد رقم 8 ما اعرف بس اي الامنية تبعت البول واي امنية تبعت المي نشرب من كله. قديش ضلت معتقل هون؟ ضليت 14 15 يوم هون بهذا السنة. كنت تعذيبكم؟ اللهم لك الحمد. شو كان جرمك اللي دخلوك فيه؟ واحد ذكر اسمه جوا تقرير ذكر اسمه بجوا طلبونا اخذونا حاجز السفير. يا سلام الحمد لله الحمد لله الحمد لله تم احسن والله.
The speed in which the Assad regime collapsed was equally breathtaking and spectacular. In barely 1 week, the counteroffensive liberated every village, town and city with hardly a shot fired and with almost zero bloodshed. Which of course is not surprising to those who have followed this conflict since 2011, and who therefore understand that very few Syrians were willing to die for the dictator they loathed. It's just an irrefutable fact that Assad would have fallen to the revolution in 2015, were it not for Russia, which stepped in with its air power, and Iran with its sectarian militias. But with Hezbollah weakened by Israeli bombardment during the past year, and with Russian military bogged down in a bloody stalemate in Ukraine, there was nobody left to save Assad from the Syrian people, as explained by a famous Syrian-American artist.
I was shocked by how quickly Assad's forces fell. It seems like it was largely economic in nature. His armies, his officers were not happy with their pay. They were unhappy, like the rest of Syria, they were unhappy with general poverty and economic decline in Syria. They didn't have much faith in the Assad regime to take care of them, and there was a lot of bitterness.
Frustratingly, many non-Syrians have been misled into believing Israel was behind the overthrow of the Syrian dictator. and I'm expressing my frustration here on behalf of every Syrian who has rightfully complained about being dehumanized and delegitimized by pro-Assad propaganda. Syrians are people who yearn for freedom, equality and justice just like everybody else. They are not pawns on a global chessboard. Their needs and aspirations come before the machinations of great power politics. So please knock it off in accusing them of being props in an obtuse Zionist conspiracy. But if you need reassurance, then please know that Israel played absolutely no active or deliberate role in the removal of Assad. In fact, the very first thing that the Zionist military did after the Syrian opposition liberated Damascus and Assad fled the country was to bomb more than 100 Assad military and intelligence sites. Sites that Israel never attacked while Assad was still in power, which reveals exactly how much fear and uncertainty Israel holds towards a Syria without the Assad family in power. You see, Israel saw no security threat from the Assad regime. He was the devil Zionists knew. He was the devil they understood. And these are not my words, but those of Israeli leaders who were comfortable with Assad because he always stayed within his lane, which is why one Zionist military leader after another has called the dictator an ally, a trusted partner, and someone they can always negotiate with. For these reasons, the toppling of the regime is bad news for Israel, particularly because Assad never fired a single missile or even one bullet at the Zionist state, even after Israel has routinely bombed Iranian and Hezbollah positions in Syria for the past decade. And let me be very clear on this point. Israel never targeted Assad. Its focus in Syria was hitting Iranian and Hezbollah positions. But even worse, Hafiz Assad promised Israel in 1974 that it would never challenge Israel's occupation of the Syrian Golan Heights. In 2010, WikiLeaks revealed that Assad told the US government that he'd be willing to betray Hamas and formally end any future claim on the Golan Heights in exchange for financial incentives. But Assad is now gone, and with him goes his promise to protect Israel from attack along the Syrian-Israeli border, which is why Israel has moved to extend its buffer zone along the occupied Golan Heights, because it rightly fears the Syrian revolutionary government will move to seize the Syrian territory and return it to the Syrian people. To further this point, it's important to again speak to these headlines from 2015, because it has misled so many into believing Israel supported the Syrian revolution, which it most definitely did not. What it did was provide limited aid to just one among dozens of rebel factions, which had broken away from the main rebel coalition in 2015. The group was Fursan al-Jalan, and it numbered fewer than 400 fighters. It was tasked with defending the Zionist-occupied Golan Heights from Iranian militias. It never attacked Assad. More recently, and I mean only 2 days before Assad fled the country, leaders of Israel's intelligence community not only explained to Israeli citizens how Assad was a buffer zone between Israel and Sunni Arabs, but also they warned that the success of the Syrian revolution will bring an end to the Sykes-Picot governed order of the Middle East.
אנחנו צריכים לוודא שיש אזור חיץ בינינו לבין הסונים, שהוא אזור חיץ שאו שמלא בכוחות צה"ל, לצורך העניין, שזה דבר שהוא אולי הוא קצת פחות ריאלי, או ששמור על ידי אנשי משטר אסד, המוחלשים עד מאוד, בתצורה שהיא תצורה מאוד מצומצמת, אחרי שרוב שטחה של סוריה נחלש, על מנת שלא נגיע לגבול משותף עם החבר'ה.
אחד, אני אישי בעד קיומו של אסד, כי הוא אויב חלש, ואויב חלש משרת את האינטרסים שלי. אף אחד לא מבטיח לאחרי נפילת אסד מי יגיע. יכול להיות אויב יותר סורר מהמשטר האיראני. מי יכול להבטיח לי? עכשיו אני יודע, יש לי אסד חלש, שכל שני וחמישי אני יכול לתקוף את סוריה בתיאום מול רוסיה וללא שום איום. אז אחד, אליהו יוסיאן במצב הנוכחי בעד קיומו של אסד.
With Assad gone, Israel is panicked, leaving with it 3 discernible and immediate objectives in Syria. Destroy the remainder of Assad's weapons to keep the revolutionary government and military weak, sow division among rebel factions to undermine the potential unity of the new government, and strengthen its defense of the occupied Golan Heights. As you can see, the world is more complicated than good guys versus bad guys, or Team A versus Team B. Geopolitics rarely runs on straight lines and hardly ever fits into binary framings. For instance, Israel and Iran are bitter rivals on some issues, but on others, their respective interests often overlap. Vis-a-vis Iran partnering with Israel against Saddam Hussein in the 1980s, and again during the US invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan in the early 2000s. making Iran an indispensable ally in the US Zionist war on terror.
طالبان دشمن ماست. آمریکا هم احساس می‌کرد طالبان دشمن ماست. و سرنگونی طالبان در درجه اول تامین کننده منافع ایران بود. گفتم بیایم تجربه افغانستان رو در مورد عراق را تکرار بکنیم. منتها این دفعه 6 به علاوه 6 باشه. 6 همسایه عراق به علاوه 5 عضو دائم شورای امنیت که آمریکا هم جزو اوناست. به علاوه
Nobody can promise what will happen in Syria next, but the early signs are encouraging. With the revolution not only promising amnesty for conscripted Assad regime soldiers, but also promising Iran it will protect Shia Muslims and their holy sites. Therefore, we must do everything that we can do to hold the new transitional government's fire to defeat on these promises, while also encouraging the removal of all foreign troops out of Syria, the lifting of economic sanctions, and a normalization of diplomatic relations. Syria's fate belongs to the Syrian people and the Syrian people alone. The road to Jerusalem runs through Damascus and a strong and united Syrian state. And trust me, Palestine will be next. The fall of oppressive and tyrannical regimes occurs more often and quicker than many people expect. And we will be here to celebrate the liberation of Palestine the same way we are celebrating the liberation of Syria today. But that's all the time I have for today. Please don't forget to subscribe to this channel, and we kindly ask you please support our effort to expose and confront injustices in the Muslim world by becoming a member of this show at patreon.com/CJWhirleman. We can't produce, sustain and grow the show without your help, and we offer exclusive benefits to those who do. But for now, good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and stay blessed.